Good day and welcome again to Leadership Devotionals. For today, we will be tackling a topic that it's quite, I should say, close to all of us. It's the declaration that says, not one of us is perfect. No one is perfect. In fact, Paul wrote this in Romans 3:23 when he said, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." And so, none of us is perfect. However, in terms of leadership, people view to us as if we are someone that is not going to make a mistake. When we view leaders, we expect no room for error in their leadership. And this expectation has placed so much pressures on leaders so that the fear of mistake has frozen a lot of leaders in their track. Sometimes, instead of making decisions, we are already impeded to make such decisions because of the fear of committing a mistake. Now let's go back again to our study on the life of Abraham. And so today's devotional is entitled The Case of Abraham, but this time it's all about redemption. Abraham was just an ordinary person born among the moon-worshipping Ur of the Chaldeans. And so most of his neighbors are idolaters and they worship the moon. So God pulled out Abraham from that very illustrious city south of Mesopotamia at 75 years old. You see, Abraham was already getting comfortable there. He would have planned a peaceful life, just raising his flock. In fact, he has thousands of them. And since he has no child, then definitely parenthood is not going to be a problem. But God has a radically different agenda for Abraham's life. God's plan for Abraham was not for him to live a settled life without children, but rather that he become a nomadic patriarch that would father a holy nation. His life would be a spiritual example even for people generations to come. The key then, Abraham was already getting settled and he has plans. He would have wished God would just bless his plans. But then, the key was not for God to bless Abraham's plans, but rather for Abraham to discard his life goals and put his life in the hands of God in favor of God's will for him. How many times, fellow leaders, we have encountered situations wherein we have beautiful plans, and yet that is not God's will either for our organization or for us. And circumstances doesn't seem to align to it, so much so that eventually we lay it on God's feet. And right there, when we lay things on God's throne of grace, we experience a peace that passeth all understanding. This is what happened to Abraham. He has plans, but that is not God's will. And so, by faith, Abraham gathered his household and set off for a land that God is going to tell him, not knowing whether he was going. Since God has so much in store for Abraham, God took time to thoroughly prepare him. Imagine to be a father of God's holy nation. God has to prepare him. That's why spiritual leadership does not happen by accident, nor it is a one-time event. It comes over time. It comes as a process. As God develops our character, your character, and in the process of developing that character, we eventually nurture a loving and closer relationship with God Himself. Character and relationship. In that process, they are all built and we become closer with God. Along this process, however, Abraham stumbled along the way. When famine hit the land, he relocated to Egypt, and Pharaoh saw his wife. Abraham lied about his relationship with his wife. Stumbled, number one. He stumbled, his first stumbling block. The second was, after already 10 years being called by God, it seems to be that God is doing nothing. And so Abraham took matters into his own hands. Succumbed to the suggestion of his wife, Sarah. Went into Hagar, and eventually they had a son. Abraham took matters into his own hands. How can he be a father of a great nation if he doesn't have a son? And so he took the bondservant of his wife. He stumbled the second time. And in another instance, Abraham was sojourning through a land, passing through the land of Abimelech, King Abimelech, and again he lied. He lied about his wife. All of this, Abraham stumbled. All of this, Abraham committed mistakes. All for the fear of his own life. But then, if you look at Abraham's story, through his failure, Abraham learned a valuable lesson regarding his modification of God's will. Abraham's mistake makes it clear that adding to God's will is just as dangerous as rejecting it altogether. You see, in Scripture, God seldom intervenes when people were about to make a mistake. Rather, He allowed them to fail but stood by their side ready to redeem them. Many individuals, through the process of failure and subsequent redemption, saw God's character revealed in a much, much deeper and intimate dimension than if God has simply stepped in to prevent them from making that mistake. I'm not saying that God will cause us to fall into error. It's always our choice. But the beauty about this, brothers and sisters, the beauty about these fellow leaders, yes, we are not perfect and we commit mistake. The redemption, the redeeming hand of God is always outstretched for you and me. That's the beauty of this. Abraham's life, Abraham's life demonstrates that attaining spiritual maturity is a lifelong up and down process. That's why if there is anything leaders must carefully evaluate and process, it is their mistakes. God forgave Abraham and helped him grow in character until he became a model of faith for generation of God's people. Undoubtedly, one of the most powerful instruments God uses in forging character is making people wait on God. To forge a character, we have to be patient. To forge that character, we have to wait on God. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. He waited 25 years for God to fulfill His promise. Abraham learned a lesson about the difference between God's timing and human beings' timing. You see, God views things from an eternal perspective, while we human beings, we only see things from a temporal vantage point. Significant character development occurs when God redeemed people from their mistakes. Through the redemption process, they learn more about themselves and more about a loving, a merciful, and forgiving God. So much so that through all these mistakes, James 2 verse 23, it's written by Apostle James, records, Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. Imagine, he was called the friend of God. Despite all those mistakes, we have a loving and forgiving God, and can even consider Abraham his friend. The experience of grace and forgiveness, of mercy, is a powerful character trait when leaders deal with their people. Remember that if you are a recipient of God's grace, mercy, and forgiveness, that realization is a powerful character trait that we can lean on when we deal with our fellow men. The appreciation of God's redeeming love in our life brings about a strong realization of our nothingness, and that strong realization of our nothingness changes our attitude towards our fellow men. We become authentic leaders. We put the needs of our people ahead than our needs, having ourselves experience grace and mercy from a loving God. Brothers and sisters and fellow leaders, a strong relationship with God, a strong relationship with a redeeming God, a God full of mercy and forgiveness and love, results also to a closer and uplifting relationship we can have with our fellow leaders, we can have with our colleagues at work, we can have with our line staff, we can have with the people under us. A strong relationship with God results to a closer and uplifting relationship with our fellow men. May this short devotional always bring to us the realization that God's redeeming love can be experienced in our lives, and we can share that redemption, that appreciation, that being merciful, that being forgiving, that being loving with the rest of the people around us. God bless us all.